for coming along here this morning. Whilst you refresh yourselves, I'm David Davis, the Chair of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee, and we are here to scrutinise the new Government of Wales bill, as you probably know. So if I may turn to Mark Williams.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. Good to see you here. And my questions are relating to improving financial accountability. And Silk was very clear in his report when he said the current funding arrangements for the Welsh Government do not meet the requirements of a mature democracy. The Secretary of State have said that these changes in the draft of the bill, the forward to the draft of the bill, the Secretary of State has said that these changes will give Wales more fiscal autonomy and make the Assembly and Welsh Government more accountable to the people of Wales. Do you accept that improving financial accountability is the key argument for devolving taxes?
In general, yes. I think that is right. I suspect, well, Jerry will speak for himself, but I suspect he may agree with me here. What's very striking about the devolved bodies across the UK, including in Wales, is that they were set up from former government departments whose job was to spend money rather than to raise money. But once they become governments, they ought to have the power to raise money as well as spend it. Raising it gives them the option of having some say over how much they spend, and setting a tax rate makes them fiscally accountable to their voters.
Yes, indeed, I entirely agree. I think one should note in the Welsh case how very small a step this is. I think the three small taxes under consideration might have a revenue yield of 200 million a year, which against a budget of 15 billion verges on insignificant. So it's a good gesture, but it isn't much more than a gesture. Of course, if the referendum is held and income tax is partly devolved, that will be somewhat more significant.
Notwithstanding what you said about the scale of the changes and the figures you mentioned, what hard evidence is out there and available to us to show that fiscal devolution does indeed promote greater accountability? I don't know what indicators we should be looking for. Perhaps you've looked at that in your respective work. But the hard evidence that this does improve the situation.
Internationally, there is some evidence that fiscal devolution leads to a flattening of tax schedules because tax competition is more effective at the top end. You know, people on basic rate tax don't move because the basic rate changes. If you think about it, you know, putting a penny on the basic rate can't cost anybody more than £300–400 a year, which doesn't pay for a removal fan, so nobody's going anywhere. But if you start taxing millionaires, you know, then they can move around. And so the presence of tax devolution means that there's some tax competition among authorities, and that does tend to flatten tax schedules. Now, I don't know whether you would count that as responsibility, but it shows people are responsive to the opportunities that tax devolution affords them.
Okay. And just a very general, almost a kick-off question. My colleagues are going to go into some of these issues in more depth, but the advantages of devolving income and land taxes, what are the advantages of that? What are the disadvantages associated with that?
You go first.
Okay. Well, land taxes are a fairly obvious thing to devolve, and that's probably why local authority taxation in the UK has always been based on some form of property tax, the old rates, and now council tax, because the tax base is not mobile. It's easy to identify. It's a tax that's hard to evade, and it's a rooted tax base. So I think if you're looking to extend the tax base of authorities that don't have an adequate tax base, looking for more taxes related to land does make sense, I think. The point about income tax is that it's a tax which is very broadly paid, and therefore it affects a large proportion of the electorate, and as such it increases the visibility of the tax policies of the devolved authority, and as such it's a good tax from an accountability point of view. Unlike houses, people can move about, so there are consequences in terms of tax competition, as I've said, but in terms of being a broad-based and highly visible tax, and therefore serving accountability, it's a good one.
I would add two things to that. I agree with Jerry that for decentralisation, immobile tax bases are the best, and therefore property being immobile is very good. People are less mobile than some other potential tax bases, for example corporate profits, which can be moved around. If you look at the taxes that are available for devolution, there are only three big taxes. There is VAT, which cannot be decentralised under European law. There is national insurance, which is like income tax, but in my view, for other reasons, shouldn't be decentralised. And there's income tax. And as Jerry says, income tax is spread across the population. A lot of people pay it. And it's also very perceptible. People notice it. If you ask someone about tax rates, most often they would begin by talking about income tax rates. So it's a good tax for devolution because it can be decentralised and it's noticeable.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Nia and then Geraint.
I'd just like to take you up on that issue of noticeable, if I may. Obviously, when you're talking about the other taxes, the stamp duty and the landfill, and an adjustment to the block grant, that may not have much of an impact on people in the same way that a council tax bill coming through the door, they see the paper says they're going up 4% or whatever, they see their bill, they think they're paying for all the council services, when in fact there is actually a block grant element there. So how do you envisage it really becoming visible for people? What way would that income tax power have to be used for people really to feel that they were having a say in whether Welsh Government spent more or spent less? And do you think it's realistic that Welsh Government would actually do something, i.e. raise it or lower it, and how would that impact on people? Do you think it would actually happen?
Can I start on that one? I think there are two issues here about perceptibility, first of all. Do people notice the tax at all? And quite often people wouldn't notice a tax, an indirect tax like VAT or duty, because they're not absolutely sure what proportion of what they're paying is for the product and what proportion is for the tax. At the other extreme, as you say, you've got council tax where the bill comes through the door and you have to fork out the cash. That's extremely perceptible. Income tax is pretty perceptible for two reasons. One, because you see it in your pay slip every month. And two, and this is where we move into the question of accountability, because the Assembly would have to set a tax rate. It would have to make a tax decision. One of the interesting things about the way in which devolution has been funded in the UK hitherto is that, for the most part, the all bodies, including the Welsh Assembly, do not have to make any tax decision, but the money still flows. And what the Scottish comparison is interesting here, because although in principle the Scottish Parliament had the power to vary income tax, it didn't have to do anything. And funnily enough, it didn't do anything. Okay? And the advantage of an income tax power, or to a lesser degree the small taxes, is that the Assembly will have to take a tax decision and take a view as to whether it is better, to use Gladstone's words, to allow the money to fructify in the profits of the taxpayers, or whether to spend money on services. So that's the decision they've got to make. The issue you raise is an important one, and that is that the total budget in comparison to the tax income isn't that great. And that does dilute the accountability, I agree. But one has to have a look at the relative spend and the tax that's available, and the tax base that's available. There is no system all across the world in which a subnational government gets all its money from the taxes it raises itself. They are all dependent on a mixture of some form of central subvention, a central grant, a share of taxes allocated or something of that sort, and taxes they raise themselves. In the Welsh case, we have to bear in mind there's a substantial spending need and a relatively weak income tax base. And therefore income tax is never going to be a huge proportion of the total Welsh spending. Nevertheless, it can be a significant one.
Just trying to bring a couple more people in briefly on this question. Geraint Davis.
Yeah, the case has been made that Wales is underfunded in terms of Barnet, certainly versus Scotland on the revenue side, and in terms of our share of capital investment across the UK, again we're underfunded. So in terms of accountability, isn't it the case that if the government is switching the focus into borrowing and indeed tax raising powers to pay for that borrowing for Wales, that the focus will go on to Wales, and therefore there'll be a reduction in the accountability of the UK government, who should be brought to account?
I think there are a number of issues there. It is true that work we did back in 2010 suggested that if Wales were a region of England and you simply applied the needs-based formula used in England to distribute health spending and local government revenue support around England, apply those formula in Wales, you come to the conclusion that Wales is slightly underfunded, 2 or 3% underfunded relative to what it would get if it were an English region. I regard that as less serious than the other fact that the Barnett formula, if unreformed, once public expenditure growth resumes, and I don't mean real growth, just growth in nominal terms, the share of spending in Wales will fall relative to England. This is just a consequence of the way the formula is set up, because let's say in England the government decides to spend £5 a head more on any service you like. If that's a devolved service, Wales would get £5 a head more. But if you're starting from a situation where English expenditure is £100 a head, 5 is on 100 is 5%. If we're starting in Wales where it's 110%, as it would be, let's say, in the northeast of England and other poorer areas, 5 on 110 is 4.5% or something. So you're going to get a slow move to squeeze Wales down to the average expenditure level in England, which does not happen in any of the areas of England. I mean, if needs-based assessments say the northeast is poorer and should get more, well, it gets more. It's not squeezed to some average. Now, the difficulty here is that the income tax devolution will necessarily, and in my opinion, appropriately, increase the risks on the Welsh Government, because you're replacing part of the block grant with your own income tax take, which will depend on the growth of the income tax base in your economy. If that grows more slowly than public expenditure in England, you're worse off as a result of this devolution. That's a risk. I think you have to take it, because otherwise the Welsh Government then is currently in a position where if the economy goes to heck in a handbasket, it gets exactly the same money. Or if it introduces wonderful policies that result in the Welsh economy booming, it sees no benefit, it still gets the same money. So unfortunately, you cannot disentangle the necessary incentives and responsibility from that other risk that, just for reasons you can't control, your income tax base grows more slowly. So it's a consequence of responsibility that you have to take that risk. But it would be very helpful if the other totally unnecessary risk implied by the Barnett formula were removed. To me, the obvious thing to do here is to say, if you pass this income tax referendum, at the moment it's passed and you assume responsibility for income tax, we will put a floor under Barnett and cease the Barnett squeeze. Now, that would at least remove one risk, an unnecessary and unfair risk, at the same time that you're imposing a necessary risk.
But surely you've described surely you've described an incentive for the Welsh Government to spend more money on economic development when it isn't in charge of its own destiny, and that will cut funding for education and health, which are the main reasons that people would invest in Wales, other than the countryside, versus other parts of Britain. And surely this is a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
No, I mean, the Welsh Government would have the same choices after this change as it has now. It itself has to decide how much of its revenue that it spends on health, education, or economic development, if it's able to do that. That is unchanged. All we're talking about is whether some of the resources that it gets should be under its own control. It gets the same. Its freedom of action is unaffected.
Just bring in Howell Williams. I'm conscious of the time. I'm really grateful for the detail that you're giving us, and I genuinely mean that. But I think we've just got to be slightly aware that we only have an hour or so, maybe a bit longer, if you gentlemen can stay a bit longer on this session, and we're still on question 2 at the moment. So.
Well, very briefly, back to Professor Gallagher, you were talking about models from other parts of the world. When this committee visited the Basque country some years ago, we were told in some details about their tax arrangements there, some of which I have to confess I can't remember by now. But are there particular lessons, or is there a particular model there which would be an alternative?
No. No, I don't think there is. The Basque Country is often cited as an example of so-called full fiscal autonomy. And the headline description which is given, which is not wholly accurate, is that the Basque Country decides on and collects all the taxes and remits a so-called cupo to Madrid. That's slightly misleading for two reasons. Well, for three reasons, actually. One, it's not actually the Basque Country itself, but subsidiary levels in the Basque Country which decide and collect taxes. Second, many of the taxes they don't actually decide, but are simply responsible for collecting, such as value-added tax. And third, one of the very major taxes they neither decide nor collect, which is social security contributions, which are decided and collected by the government and Madrid. And the final constraint is that their capacity to vary taxes compared with the rest of Spain is limited by the Spanish constitution. So it is almost never sensible to try and pluck some model from somewhere else and transplant it. You've always got to look at the context. But of all the models you might pluck, I wouldn't suggest the Basque one.
Sorry to kind of slip one in myself, if I may, just before Jessica Morden. You've obviously studied a lot of countries around the world. You've made the point that Wales would only be responsible for raising a tiny proportion, probably under 1%, I should think, of the total £15 billion budget. 200 million out of 15 billion. I can't do
the minor taxes. It's about a third of 1%, maximum.
Is there a model anywhere in the world that you think is a standard model, either in the Basque countries, Italy, Germany, any of the devolved regions, for the percentage, if you like, that a devolved region could normally be expected to raise by itself?
I don't think there is a model, and I think we must remember here that there are two variables. The two variables are what proportion of spending is decentralised and what proportion of taxing is decentralised. And the proportion, therefore, of the devolved budget that's supported by tax depends on those two variables. So if you've got a big budget, as the Welsh Assembly does, it's responsible for pushing 40%, I think, off the top of my head, of public spending in Wales, possibly more, and a small tax base, you therefore have a very small percentage of your budget. And you could argue that if you wanted to gain greater, as it were, fiscal autonomy, you should spend less and therefore have a greater proportion. I don't think anyone is recommending that in this context. Therefore, there's no standard formula. Right. I mean, I absolutely agree that even if you include local taxes, where Wales is today, doesn't allow it any meaningful fiscal accountability. I don't think in practice it's going to be possible to get to even the proportions that are conceivable in the case of Scotland, but it should be in practice possible, if you include income tax, to get to proportions which are at least comparable to those in local government.
Thank you. Just very quickly.
Yes, I mean, obviously we've seen in your submissions that the tax take in Wales is considerably lower. I think you put it at 1,300 as opposed to 2,000 in the UK as a whole. Given as a proportion of the budget of the Welsh Government, would the pain be worth the gain in them putting on 1 pence extra on that small slice of income tax which they would have the power to do? In other words, you know, the amount they could raise, would it be really of any significance in that budget?
Well, the short answer is no. There is a great flaw with this bill, which stems from the fact that the British government takes the view that Wales can't possibly have anything that it hasn't already given to Scotland. You know, we are the runt of the litter. Basically, we get the hand-me-downs that the other people have had, and don't, for God's sake, ask for anything different. Because it was pointed out by the Silk Commission, and indeed by the commission that I chaired, that this lockstep arrangement, whereby you have the same tax rates for basic and higher rates, and if you increase the tax, you increase everybody's marginal rate, will make the tax in Wales virtually unusable. You simply cannot afford. I mean, As an equalitarian myself, I regret this, but one has to face reality. In Wales, you simply cannot afford to raise the top rate of income tax. You just can't do it. People move, on average, once every 10 years. 50% of the Welsh population lives within 25 miles of the border. Anybody on $1 million or $500,000 a year has probably got 2 homes. I mean, you're just going to lose more money than you'll gain over a 5 and 10 year period. So raising the higher rate of tax is impossible in Wales unless you wish to lose revenue. Therefore, if you want to raise tax, you have to raise the basic rate only. If you want to cut tax, you can cut the top rate, but these things are ruled out by this legislation. You're making sure that this is a power that is very unlikely to be used.
Well, you must move on. Thank you, Jessica Moore.
In your written evidence, Mr. Oldham, you said you think the weakness of the bill is that much of it would remain a dead letter. Then do you anything you wish to add to that, given your previous comment?
Well, yes, because you're asking Welsh politicians to fight a highly losable referendum. You know, tax isn't popular, and to be frank, neither are politicians at the present time. It's most unfair, but there it is. You know, so you're asking them to fight a losable referendum for a tax power they can't use. You know, I mean, it doesn't look like a high odds proposition to me. The only incentive the British government is giving them is to say, well, if you get this power, we'll let you borrow a bit more. The difference, as far as we can tell, is between borrowing 500 million and 12 or 1300 million. No, maybe that'll be enough, but I don't think. I rather doubt whether it will. I think from an electoral point of view, it's great to have accountability. But who the hell wants to be accountable if they can avoid it? You're telling politicians, you'll be more accountable, and we'll give you a power you can't use. Now go out and persuade people to let you have tax powers. I mean, you know, it's not exactly odds on, is it? So I think the bill needs to be augmented, as I was saying earlier, by a promise that if this referendum is held and passed, at that point there will be an amendment, not a wholesale reform, a simple amendment to the Barnett formula to put a floor in place, which would at least give the politicians something to go with when they're talking to the electorate.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just ask Professor Gallagher about the Scottish experience? What, in terms of the Scotland Act 2012, what are the differences between this and the draft Wales bill?
Very few. The scheme which is in this bill is essentially the same scheme in respect of income tax and small taxes as it is in the Scotland Act 2012. That went through the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament supported it, and provided another referendum goes the way in which the UK government would like it to go, that scheme will come into effect in Scotland in 2016. So we've got no experience as yet of operating it. I suppose I might add, however, 2 caveats to what Jerry said. The first is, if I might address Mr Griffith's question rather more directly. Your question was not about the variability of rates, but whether it was worth the pain because you didn't raise very much more money. And I think that is a real constraint, but nevertheless there may well come an occasion when a Parliament wants to raise some more money and the tax will allow it to do so. Conversely, in principle, a Parliament, the gearing works the other way in relation to saving money. If you want to cut the taxes, it doesn't cost you very much pain in reduced services proportionately. So that gearing argument cuts both ways.
And as can I just come back on that? And as they're so similar, you know, people obviously argue design for Wales applied to design for Scotland applied to Wales. Would you like to get? I think we've heard Mr Holton's view on that, but would you like to say how appropriate you feel that is?
Well, my own view is that if we maintain the UK as a union with a number of different countries in it, we need to have a form of home rule, if that's the phrase one wants to use, which is appropriate to each of the countries. And I don't think it is absolutely the case that every detail of the home rule scheme for Scotland and Wales needs to be the same. Obviously, in relation to powers, there's already a difference, principally at the Scottish Parliament, building on the fact that Scotland always had a legal system, has power over legal issues that aren't currently devolved in Wales. And I do agree with Jerry that it would be possible to adjust the funding system to reflect the realities of life in Wales, where the tax base is weak and the spending need is high. And I think his idea of at least considering whether there could be a floor to the Barnett firm is a perfectly sensible one, and it's one which I don't think would have an undesirable read across to either Scotland or Northern Ireland. As far as the variability of tax rates is concerned, I think there are two difficulties with this. One is the argument of principle which was used in creating the Scotland Act scheme, which was that questions of progressivity or regressivity in the tax systems were ones which were best dealt with at Westminster because issues of redistribution were best dealt with at this level. And the second is a bit more, is a bit cruder. And Jerry puts the positive side for allowing Wales a degree of flexibility over the higher rate to stop people leaving Wales. But of course, it might also be seen as a way of attracting retired bankers and Premiership footballers to move across the border and hand over their tax revenues. And I'm a bit uncomfortable, I've got to admit, with that kind of tax farming.
Okay, a quick one from Harold.
Can I just check with Mr Holtham? Is it your understanding that the £500 million borrowing is available before any referendum? He's talked about 500 million, then 1,200 million earlier on.
Yes, as I understand it, it's been agreed between the Welsh Government and the UK Government that 500 million total borrowing is available on the basis of the smaller taxes that are being devolved in any event before the referendum. I don't think a final number has been agreed, but that's the sort of the general understanding. And the 1.2, 1.3 billion is what would happen if a similar settlement to the Scottish one were adopted after the income tax referendum, if it were to happen and to be passed. So that's the difference between the two numbers. Yeah.
I'm happy to go on with this, but actually we've got a load of questions on borrowing afterwards. If members of the committee want to, I'm quite happy to go to it now if you feel that's more appropriate. If not, I've got one quick question on tax, because happily you managed to answer all the ones on my list in your previous comments, and that's actually really whether there would be a difficulty in defining who a Welsh taxpayer is. I mean, clearly it's obvious in most cases, but for people with two homes or who move around a bit, MPs, for example, could well be spending more time in London than they are in Wales if they're assiduous in their duties.
That's certainly an issue. The basis of this is residential. It's not your place of work. It's your primary residence. The fact that it's happened already in Scotland, the Indian Revenue has had to wrestle with this issue, is an advantage, because many of the issues and the administrative procedures they have to put in place will be there because of Scotland, and they can simply apply them in Wales. But yeah, I think there's no doubt that to some extent this tax for certain people will be there'll be a certain voluntary element. I mean, you know, you can if you've got a house in both places and you're spending equal time in both places, there is a degree of latitude. And from the point of view of outright evasion, if people want to tell their employers that they live where they don't, the government is not going to make the employer legally responsible for the accuracy of his records when it comes to where people live. So there will be, one just has to accept that there is an unavoidable margin for avoidance or evasion.
I think to add to that, I think there are 2 points. The first is that, as Jerry says, we've had, in principle at least, this possibility in Scotland since 1999. So the revenue was obliged to maintain a list of Scottish taxpayers and to in very simple terms, people's national insurance numbers would have an S on them, and their tax reference number is the same, it had an S on it. What the bill provides for is a system which is exactly analogous to the questions of domicile used in deciding whether someone is resident in the UK or not, because obviously if you're a resident in Wales, you're resident in the UK. The principal challenge in administering this is making sure that employers apply the correct tax code. Though I have a feeling, I haven't checked the bill on this, but I have a feeling that elected representatives are held to be resident in the place which they represent.
I think we've given ourselves an exception.
That should make it easy for you.
No, I've had a quick look, and I think you may have answered a few of the questions that I think Howell and Nia were about to put to you. But Nia wanted to ask something in between, so I'll let them work out whether they need to.
Just on that one, I mean, imagine your Airbus doing payroll. So you've got a huge workforce, and you've got obviously people living both sides of the border. You're saying that it would be quite simple. You just have a tax code, and it would sort of sort itself out.
For most people, this will be done by payroll software, and for a long time, in respect of Scotland, all the payroll software, in order to be compliant with revenue regulations, had to be able to administer a potential Scottish income tax. The same should apply in relation to Wales. I'm not saying it will be without problems, but by comparison with what other countries manage, this is pretty simple.
Mr. Davis used the term tax farming, which brings something to mind. The Inland Revenue certainly will charge the devolved, or is proposing anyway, to charge the devolved government for the extra costs of collecting their tax. In my opinion, this needs to be subject to a very specific contract, and I would make it a tax sharing arrangement. In other words, we are not going to give you the fee you want. We're going to give you some proportion of it plus a proportion of the tax revenue we receive, because otherwise I have no confidence that the revenue will be particularly assiduous in making sure that all the revenues which are due to to Wales they'll actually get. There might be a reverse Goldman Sachs process where they're not careful enough. So I'm
not sure I agree with that.
I would give them an incentive to make sure that these administrative arrangements are thoroughly applied.
Super. Maybe I can see if Howell and Nia have got questions that weren't in there.
Thanks, Professor Holston. Could an income tax sharing model be adopted before reform of the banded formula? Is this desirable?
Well, anything can happen. The First Minister of Wales, of course, is on the record as saying he thinks that a reform of Barnett is a precondition for accepting income tax reform. For the reasons I've given, I certainly think it would help matters and would help to secure and win a referendum, if that's what you want. I do think he's maybe focused on slightly the lesser of the problems with the Barnett formula. There is this calculation that we made that Wales is slightly underfunded, but it's 2 or 3%. These things are infinitely discussable. It's not a massive amount. The current austerity, of course, puts the Barnett squeeze into reverse, so that the Welsh shortfall is becoming slightly smaller. It still exists, but it's becoming smaller. To me, that's a second-order issue compared to this issue that once growth resumes, the squeeze will go on, and in 10 years' time, unless nothing's done, you won't be, a few hundred million underfunded. You'll be $1 billion or more underfunded. So it is essential, I think, to stop the squeeze. I wouldn't worry too much about the 2-3%, but that's just my opinion. But certainly, some reform, I think, would be necessary to lubricate this process.
Just quickly to pick up with Professor Gallagher. Just about comparing the mobility of taxpayers between Scotland and England and Wales and England. I mean, it's not the same. The border is closer, it's more porous.
That's right. Yes.
My father-in-law is something of a nationalist. He usually greets me with how goes it on building the eastern seaboard, but we actually don't have one.
Yes. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the interesting pieces of work which Jerry did in the Commission on Funding for Wales was to analyse where the taxpayers were. And of course, there's a large number of taxpayers within a relatively short distance of the Welsh border. Whereas if you look at the Scottish-English border, the taxpayers get pretty thin around there. They're more sheep than taxpayers.
Can I just follow up on that? Is there any merit in the argument that a higher tax rate, which would be lowered, would increase the take, as it were, a lower tax, higher take? If we attracted people in?
Well, it depends what you regard as a good thing. I mean, if you think attracting higher rate taxpayers in from England is a good thing for the Welsh economy and will produce revenue for the Welsh Government, then the opportunity for doing that in Wales is much greater than in Scotland. If, on the other hand, you think that encouraging people to move from one place to another in order to minimise their tax liability is a bad thing, then there is less of that danger in Scotland and more of that danger in Wales. So it depends what you value.
Can I just insert a word there? I think it's a perfectly reasonable point that you don't want to create a situation in which the tax base is cannibalized because there's a competition to reduce taxes. On the other hand, governments quite happily spend money on regional policy. And what the hell is a regional policy except an attempt to move economic activity from one area to another? So, in my way of thinking, you have to limit this. Nobody's suggesting that Wales should be able to abolish the top tax rate and become the Isle of Man. I mean, that isn't the suggestion. But a limited ability to do that is just a tax expenditure, and it can be seen in exactly the same terms as any government expenditure aimed at promoting regional development when you've got large inequalities across in regional activity across the country.
And just to add partly in support of that, of course, this would be very significant for Wales, but the loss wouldn't be very significant for England.
Just a brief question on the point you've just made. I mean, clearly there's a lot of people who take the view that the lockstep is not a sensible, because it renders it unusable. I may have some sympathy with that view. But you've just said that if there wasn't a lockstep, that there should in fact be a limitation on the degree. I mean, in Scotland it was 3 pence, it was 3%. Well, if there was no lockstep, would you still envisage there being, for it to work properly, that there would be a limitation on, say, the amount you could reduce the top rate by?
Yes, I mean, I think we mustn't take too binary a view here, that either the tax, you've got no control over the tax, or you can do anything you like with the tax. If you have frameworks for what a devolved authority can do with the tax, it greatly opens up the possibilities for devolution. You can partially devolve things that you couldn't dream of fully devolving. I don't think you should devolve the income tax to Wales and say you can do anything you like with the top rate. I mean, that would be to invite. I don't think the Welsh government would do it, but that would be to invite a tax haven kind of strategy.
The opposite.
The opposite?
I mean,
bang it up.
If I may say so, if I may just come in with something, you're making the assumption that if the Welsh Assembly had that power, that it might see some financial gain in reducing the top rate of tax. But I personally think, and I don't know what your opinion is, that it's equally possible the Assembly may say, we actually don't like the rich very much, we're a left-wing party, whichever one is in charge, possibly not including the Conservatives, and we're going to tax these so-and-sos. I mean, I think is that not equally as likely to happen?
You know, I mean, if you look around the world, that isn't what tends to happen. I mean, I acknowledge there are those instincts in certain quarters in Wales, but the brute fact is that a left-wing government serves its people by providing public services that they couldn't afford if they were provided privately. And the way it does that is by maximising its revenue. And raising the top rate of tax is not going to maximise their revenue.
But that's not a lesson that's been grasped in all quarters, yeah?
To France at this point in time. So I think political parties often do go with their instinct rather than with common sense.
And so did Mitterrand. But then he reversed within 18 months. And I'll give you quite a free prediction about Hollande now. I mean, there are certain realities. It's very hard to balance.
I started this, and I deserve this. But I better call Geraint for a quick question.
Hollande's instincts either. But my understanding is there's about 8,000 people in Wales who are on the top rate of 45p. And therefore, if you wanted to raise the same money at 40p, if you reduced it from 45 to 40, you'd only need 9,000. So the change in the number of rich people in Wales to balance the books at a significantly lower rate is very small.
Exactly.
And therefore, if these people are sitting on the border, the idea of tax farming and migration of large numbers of very rich people is a real opportunity for Wales, or if you don't like the idea, the cannibalisation is there as well. But if there wasn't a lockstep, would you agree that there's a very significant opportunity for more money for Wales from richer taxpayers?
That is my view, and as I say, I think you should restrict that. I don't think you should let them, I mean, I take the point they may not do it, but I don't think you should give them the opportunity to completely cannibalise the UK tax system. That's no part of my argument. But even 1 or 2 or 3p is not going to have a material effect in England. It could have a material effect in Wales.
Thank you. Fascinating debate, but perhaps we've got to move on. So get it there. Yes, on the perhaps on the cost of a referendum.
I'm not sure whether I'm that interested in the question of the cost of the referendum. I'm more interested in the question, the concerns that's been expressed by yourselves as to whether we should have a referendum on the tax issue. I understand the arguments that you're making, which is that the gains from having the powers to vary tax might be small, and therefore the risk is high. But surely a significant change of this nature should be subject to a vote amongst the people of Wales.
I think we've got into an unfortunate... Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that we've established a precedent that significant constitutional change requires a referendum. But we've got into an unfortunate position in Wales whereby, you know, we're doing devolution on the instalment plan. And
but there's always a process, not an event.
That may be perfectly sensible, by the way. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily stupid. But it would have been good to have had a referendum at the start that says, should we do devolution on the instalment plan? And if you got a yes vote, you then didn't have to have a referendum on every minor adaptation to the... I mean, even the one on legislation, the legislation is going to allow you to prime legislation in, I forget the numbers, 28 areas with 32 exceptions. You know, I mean, the public is not interested in that degree of detail. I think they want to vote on a principle and then leave it to the political politicians.
The point made about income tax being devolved is the fact that it is visible. It will have an impact in terms of people being aware that the Welsh Government is raising taxes. So surely the point you make about devolution of powers is not the same as devolution of income tax, because that sheer visibility does demand, I would argue, that the people of Wales have a vote on the issue.
But as I say, I mean, I don't disagree in principle that a shift of tax-raising powers should be subject to some sort of referendum at some point. But I suppose I'm making the Irish argument that we shouldn't be starting from here. Really. I'm not sure what I'd say about the present situation, but you know, it is the case that we're holding series of referenda on what are relatively small shifts, and that can't be sensible. It would have been better. It would be better to have one and say, look, we're on a process. I mean, after all, political parties can run for office in Wales and in Westminster on whether they want more or less, and you know, we're supposed to have a parliamentary democracy. I think we're overdoing the referendum.
I think Wales has overdone the referendums, but we are where we are. I suppose the lessons I would draw from that are, please don't overdo them again. And if it is inevitable, I think, that there's going to have to be a referendum before there are income tax powers. That's the political reality, it's the legislative reality. I suppose the question is, if people are at any point thinking of further development of devolution, which is by no means out of the question, please don't put the Welsh people through yet another referendum afterwards. Could you not get this one in a job lot?
Okay. And in terms of the cost, I better just identify the issue of the cost. What roughly would you be anticipating the cost of a referendum and income tax to be to the Welsh government?
I have no idea.
Sorry, I haven't done that sum.
I don't think that was a question, actually.
No, it's a question. I was asking just out of interest.
But I just want to just pursue this issue of a referendum, because perhaps I'm unusual in my party. I'm not in favour of a referendum. I mean, I think we should announce at the general election this is our view, and if the people vote this to office, then we can carry it through. But I think that's probably just a view I hold and isn't going to happen. But I think what worries me a bit more is that what we would be doing is a referendum which might deliver a system that isn't usable. I mean, it just won't be usable. Well, then do we have to have another referendum to amend it to make it usable? By removing the lockstep or whatever. I mean, I just see having a referendum on something that isn't usable is completely mad.
I think the answer to that is probably no. And the reason I think the answer to that is no is that if you look at the Scottish precedent, the reason there has been no subsequent referendum in Scotland on extending the powers of the Scottish Parliament to the tax powers it has now under the 2012 Act is that the initial referendum in Scotland was, if you remember, a two-question referendum. Should there be a Scottish Parliament and should it have tax powers? Now, admittedly, those tax powers were relatively limited, but the principle was there in the Scottish referendum. Unfortunately, the 1999 referendum in Wales didn't mention tax powers, and at some point, I guess, therefore, tax powers are going to have to be subject to the view of the people. But subsequently adjusting the tax powers is a different matter, as the Scottish precedent shows.
The referendum should be framed in sufficiently general terms that it covers subsequent changes, I think is the point.
Can I bring in
Thank you. Yeah, and just following up with that, not least because we have the spectre of Part 2 of Silk and possible transfer of more power, so there may well be a referendum linked up with that lot. I hesitate to ask this question now. It's rather tame. I think I know the answer, but what difference will the devolution of stamp duty, land tax and landfill tax make to Welsh financial accountability, given the scale of what you're saying? Very little, but nonetheless...
Yes. Relatively little, I think it's only fair to say. Stamp duty is a visible tax. People do buy and sell houses, and they're very aware of it at the time. So if the Welsh government does anything with it, it will attract, it will attract attention. And so I wouldn't say there was no gain in accountability, but it is limited.
Well, I think it is worth spotting that, of course, accountability and autonomy go together, and these are powers which the Welsh Government, the Welsh Assembly, would exercise, first of all, to influence their total budget, but secondly, in relation to those taxes, the taxes are also policy instruments. So stamp duty is a policy instrument in relation to the housing market, and of course all the other powers in relation, most of the other powers in relation to the housing market are devolved to the Welsh Assembly. So that it extends the policy tools available to the body, and that's a good thing in my view.
And the same piece of the landfill tax.
Indeed, yes.
Were there, other than the taxes we've already mentioned, were there additional areas that you felt that Silk perhaps should have looked at, and perhaps the government should be looking at? Other taxes that should be devolved?
Well, as Professor Gallagher said, within an economic union, there are certain restrictions on which taxes it's sensible to devolve. One of the things that both the Calman Commission and Silk said might be devolved is air passenger duty, which I know the Welsh Government is keen on. It's been devolved to Northern Ireland for long-haul flights only, and I think restricting it to long-haul flights does actually remove most of the objections to devolution. Obviously, if you devolved air passenger duty to Wales and the Welsh Government abolished it for Cardiff Airport, Bristol would have a complaint. But if it's long haul, there's no long runway in Bristol. They don't do long haul. So to that extent, it's just less of an issue. So I think it would have been possible to devolve long haul APT if it's a fairly minor matter, but it could have been done. And I'm not quite sure why the Treasury is so hostile. In the case of Scotland, there's not much competition in long haul between Scottish airports. The nearest one is Manchester, I suppose. So it's, it seems to me I'm slightly puzzled by their reticence there. But there's that one. I mean, I myself don't take the same view as Professor Gallagher about the impossibility of devolving corporation tax, but you certainly, again, couldn't just do it. You would have to have very strict protocols on what could be done. And it would require a reform in the way that corporation tax liability is assessed. At the moment, it's a brass plate operation. If I put my brass plate in Swansea, then I pay my tax there. Which is why the London Mayor is able to go around claiming that all the economic activity occurs in London. That's because all the companies are registered here, and this is where the corporation tax is. The fact the factory is in the Wirral or somewhere, it doesn't seem to matter. If you had a system whereby, as you do in the United States, whereby corporation tax liability depended on where your payroll was, then you collect it centrally and hand it out according to such a criteria. If you did that, and you restricted the extent to which changes could be made in it, you could devolve corporation tax. But there are two very big ifs there, and it's not on the agenda at the moment. So.
I agree with that analysis. If you're going to devolve corporation tax, the way to do it is the way which Jerry has described. I suppose the reservations I have about corporation tax can be summed up in the words Starbucks and Amazon. That the more complexity you put into the tax system, the more opportunity you give for evasion. Just to complete the picture, there are a few other small taxes you might think about. In principle, you might think about capital gains tax on real property to complete the property tax bundle, though the administration of that would be very difficult because you would have to think about separate capital gains limits for real property and other assets, and that might be difficult for the rest of the UK. And the other one is inheritance tax, which is a personal tax, raises relatively small sums of money. The precedent from Australia for decentralising isn't a very attractive one, but in principle I guess it would be possible.
Thank you very much. Howell Williams and then Neil Griffith, and then we move to Geraint.
Yep. Just a very brief one. In your opinion, does the revenue stream available from the minor taxes, such as SDLC and aggregates, constitute an independent revenue stream which may in turn trigger the £500 million borrowing limit?
Yeah, my understanding is that that's more or less been agreed. And if you think about it, I mean, we're fortunate in the sense to be living in a time of low interest rates. You know, if they can borrow at 4%, shade over Treasury rate, then you know, 500 million is only going to cost you 20 million a year, and the new taxes will bring in maybe 200 million a year. So certainly there's no issue about carrying capability there.
Thank you with that.
Neil Griffith.
That's my question. Firstly, is there any motivation for the Welsh Government to vary stamp duty or landfill tax because of what would happen to the block grant? And secondly, what flexibility would they have, in other words, you know, to charge different values of property, different amounts? How much flexibility would they have, and in practice would they use it?
Well, the first thing to say is the Act is mute on exactly how the block grant will be adjusted for once the taxes are devolved. And there are various ways to do this, and I am the world's greatest bore on this on this subject. There's a lot of algebra in the report that I chaired on exactly this issue. So it really depends on what discussions result in terms of how the block grant is to be adjusted. It's not so much the immediate adjustment. You can guess what revenue is going to be this year, or you can count what revenue is this year and take that off the block grant. It's what you do going forward that is the big issue.
Given how small the sums are, that shouldn't be a major problem to negotiate with the Treasury. The interesting one is what you do if you devolve income tax.
That's absolutely right. But so in terms of but to answer the rest of your question, so how attractive it will be depends really on those discussions. But yes, as far as I can understand, they would have complete control of the structure of these taxes as well as the rates. It's not like income tax. If they want to abolish them or change them radically, they're able to do so. And indeed, in Scotland, there's been a lot of discussion about reform of the tax on housing transactions, because it's so-called slab-sided tax, which leads to big jumps at certain house prices. And trying to flatten that out is one of the things that they've been looking at in Scotland. It's quite difficult to do without causing big winners and losers as you go up the schedule. So it's not that easy, but the sort of thing they would have to think about.
If I could add to that, I think there is, as it were, a relatively limited opportunity simply to consider reforming stamp duty land tax, which I think most economists would agree isn't a particularly well-designed tax for the reasons that Jerry says. But what we will have, if the bill goes through, is a system under which all property taxation in Wales will be able to be looked at in the round, and indeed in Scotland as well. And one of the UK's long-term strategic issues for the tax system is that we under-tax property. And this gives both the devolved administrations the opportunity to have a root and branch look at how we tax all property, both on an ongoing basis and in relation to transactions. Because there's an economic argument which says you should tax property more continually rather than at the time of transaction. It's handy to do it at the time of transaction because there's cash around, but of course putting a tax on a transaction may discourage a transaction. A transaction might well be economically desirable.
Are you saying the power is here not only to have that transaction tax, but have the equivalent of a mansion tax?
The mansion tax would be done by altering the bands in the council tax, which my recollection is within the powers of the Assembly.
Yes, in fact, they already have introduced an additional band in council tax above those that exist in England, and they have the power to completely reshape that if they wish to do so.
Thank you very much. Geraint Davis.
Yeah, is there any concern that with the devolution of income tax and increased borrowing powers that we'll go to a situation where the borrowing powers are sort of maximised and therefore top slicing the block grant or indeed income tax to undermine revenues in Wales at a time that maybe we should be talking about getting our fair share of capital spend in the UK?
When you say a fair share of capital spend, you're referring to things like Network Rail or public agencies
if you just took HS2, you could argue Wales should have an extra £2 billion as the share of that infrastructure investment. It's controversial, but it sort of dwarfs what we're talking about here. And isn't it the case that what's happened is the political agenda has been refocused on these marginal borrowing powers, when really what we want in Wales is capital investment? We've got our eye off the ball.
Well, I have to say that the Barnett formula determines well, put it this way: the Barnett formula has no statutory basis. So if the Treasury want to move the goalposts, they can put them on the halfway line, and there's nothing to be done about it. And so when you're looking at something like HS2, if they determine that, look, this is in the interest of the UK as a whole, it's not specifically for England, therefore there's no question of a Barnett, consequential, there's no court of appeal except, making a big political fuss. Now, that is a situation which has persisted. I make no partisan point. Under every British government that I've ever lived under, none of them has shown any appetite for reforming this. So I don't know that we're diverting attention. There wasn't any attention there in the first place.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I quite swallow the premise of your question, Mr. Davis. To the extent that the Barnett formula is properly applied, where Wales gets a share of relevant capital spending, you might well run an argument which says, given the economic development needs of Wales, the UK should divert substantial investment by the UK government into Wales. That's a perfectly plausible argument, though I haven't actually heard it made. But I don't think giving Wales the power to borrow and invest is anything other than a good thing for Wales.
Any further?
Yeah. So, can you comment on the right level of borrowing for Wales? I know we've been talking about 500 million, and that's explained, but what do you think over time would be a sensible level of borrowing limit for Wales?
I think the Welsh capital budget at the moment under the block grant is, I think, roughly £1.5 billion of that order. So the amount of borrowing ought to be at least in the same order of magnitude as that, by which I don't mean £1.5 billion, I mean having at least the same number of digits, okay, as that. So 500 million, 1.2, 1.3 billion doesn't seem to me to be, as it were, out of the ordinary. Two things are striking. The first is that 500 million comes, as it were, with the very small taxes, but the great slug of income tax only brings another 700 or so. So there's no particular proportionality there. You might argue that, therefore, the 700 million or so was a bit weak. On the other hand, you might say the 500 was maybe a bit generous. Provided that the borrowing is repaid, and borrowing has to be repaid, and provided that the Welsh Government, and I say this very carefully because governments struggle sometimes, is capable of investing it in a way which will be economically wise. I'm sure it can do that, but it has to be very careful. I don't see why, in principle, it shouldn't be a bit more than that.
May I say, in the past, there's whatever it is, 15.7 billion that Welsh Government gets. To a certain extent, there's been flexibility between whether they invest that in revenue and capital. And given if they had much greater borrowing powers, they could bring forward investment in, for instance, hospitals and the like, and spread that cost over many years through borrowing, especially if they fix them at low interest rates now. So you could make the argument that the borrowing powers for Wales should be much, much higher, irrespective of devolution of income tax.
I think you could, and one of the things that underpins that argument would be that, for reasons good and bad, Wales has invested much less in private equity or private finance arrangements of the PFI or PPP type, and therefore there are very low liabilities in Wales compared to Scotland or indeed England. So the Welsh Government isn't carrying any particular burden of debt at the present time. If you included that, then there's quite a large capacity. I mean, if you think about it, what proportion of your revenue might it be sensible to commit to debt servicing? If you said 5%, for example, that would enable Wales to, to borrow several billion. So I think the powers post income tax are fairly tight. They could be enlarged somewhat without risk to prudence, I think.
Are we all working on the assumption that the UK government would underwrite any bonds that the Welsh Assembly government issued, any borrowing that it made?
I don't think it's proposed in the bill that the Welsh Assembly government would get its borrowing by issuing bonds directly. It would borrow the money from the Treasury, and therefore its obligation would be to the Treasury rather than the markets. And that's actually perfectly sensible, because the UK government will get a better interest rate than the Welsh government would, just in the nature of things.
Although that's true in general, absolutely. Although having the ability to issue bonds has the wonderful effect on the rates that get quoted to you by the Debt Management Office. Only because local authorities could issue bonds if they wanted to, did the Debt Management Office suddenly find it could charge them 40 basis points over rather than 140 over, which it was trying to do. So the Silk Commission did recommend that the Welsh Government should have the power to issue bonds, but this was another area where the Scots haven't got it, so we can't have it either.
Okay. Perhaps I shall turn quickly to Howell then. Oh, no, sorry, you did want to
only quick question, really, to finish off on the referendum point, is to ask you whether either of you have turned your mind to a form of words which the Electoral Commission may be comfortable with, and which would, I think, summarise the conversation that we've had today in a way that could be understood.
The short answer, I'm afraid, is no. I haven't. Maybe other, later witnesses for whom this is an area of speciality can help you more. My only thought is that, as I said earlier, that the thing should be phrased sufficiently generally that we don't feel the need to keep coming back and having these very detailed referenda.
Yeah, I agree with that, but it would have to mention the words income tax. Beyond that, I wouldn't like to do the drafting. The last referendum wording started out bad and got, if anything, marginally worse. But this one isn't such a convoluted proposition.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from Hal Williams?
Well, I think I should ask you just about the estimated cost of the implementation of the financial settlement sections of the Scotland Act, which I understand was 40 to 45 million, including 10 million on IT and 4.2 million on annual running costs. What costs do you anticipate for the Welsh Government in connection with the implementation of this bill?
I personally made an estimate of the cost. Those Scottish numbers will probably turn out to be wrong in one direction or another, because it hasn't yet been done, though the work is going on just now and the revenue are getting ready for 2016. I think it would be sensible to make a better estimate of the Welsh costs once we've seen what the Scottish costs actually are. But we are certainly talking about two figures of millions, that's for sure.
They will be a lot less than Scotland, simply because there's an element of fixed cost in this, in setting up, in devising and setting up the procedures, and that's been done for Scotland and can be applied to Wales. So I think Professor Gallagher is quite right. We're talking millions, but it will be a lot less than Scotland, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for staying on a little bit, and we apologise for running over. It's been a very interesting session, and it could have turned into quite a lively debate at one point as well. So we're very grateful to both of you. Thanks a lot. Gito, you're first on this.
Gito. I haven't looked at the ring. I've just got to ring my note.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No problem at all. No problem. You're not down. I'm
well, that's all
afraid,
right.
but,
I'll just
come in. Professors Jones and Scully, Wynne Jones, we've met before, obviously, at various village halls, I think, in Monmouthshire. Nice to see you all again. I'm the chairman of the Select Committee. So we're just going to start off. Apologies that we were a bit late, but we got into a bit of a discussion there. Could I start with Gito Bebb, please?
What a down. We've heard a lot of evidence this morning which has highlighted the fact that despite the significant differences between Wales and Scotland, a lot of the draft Wales Bill appears to be very similar to what has been proposed and implemented in a Scottish context. So do you think that is a weakness or a strength of these proposals, and can you explain in relation to your response?
Okay. I think that in particular the position in the bill on the lockstep is deeply problematic. It runs against all the evidence in Holtham in particular, which I think everybody accepts as the authoritative source on this. It runs against the arguments in Silk, and it renders the tax power, the income tax powers, pretty much unusable. To vary from England is pretty much inconceivable. Of course, the thing which is radically different from the Scotland Act 2012 is the referendum provision, and I hope at some stage you'll ask me for my views on that.
But I wanted a wider response to the first question.
I think in terms of the detail, it follows Scotland and Wales ways which are unhelpful and are not supported by the evidence that we have.
So you highlighted the lockstep. Are there any other areas where you'd highlight the similarities being a concern?
I would say personally that is the key element of this bill, which is that, and the referendum provisions are the really problematic elements in this bill.
Okay. Professor Scully?
And I think I broadly agree with Richard, and I suppose maybe anticipating some later discussions. And I think, personally, I'm not particularly persuaded of the principal case for a referendum. I think that argument is, things have moved on. But I think it does, if you think about practically what a referendum would actually look like, I think it starts to look very problematic in terms of who is actually going to be motivated to go out and campaign for what looks like a close to unusable power.
So just to clarify on the issue of the referendum then, since both of you have raised the issue of the referendum, I take it then that it's not necessarily the principle of having a referendum on the devolution of income tax powers which is a concern, rather the fact that the powers for income tax variation as it stands in the current draft bill would be practically unusable even if there was a yes vote in a referendum. Is that your real concern?
No, that's not my position. I don't know about Roger's. My own position is I'm against this on principle. And can I explain why?
Yes.
The argument has been accepted by all parties that you need tax powers to make devolved government properly accountable. Fiscal responsibility is an argument which is there in Holtham, it's there in Calman, it's there in Silk. It underpins the Scotland Act 2012. It's been accepted very widely. And my question to you is, should responsibility and accountable be optional? Should those things be optional? I think no. That's my view. I think that in principle there should not be.
A response from myself would be that the consent of the people is pretty important as well. And after all, the original devolution powers granted in Scotland did include a vote on the issue of whether there would be tax variation. So the principle of tax variation was part and parcel of the 97 settlement in Scotland, but there's no such vote in Wales.
Okay, there are basically three arguments that are put forward why we should have a referendum. One is the so-called Scottish precedent. The other, a second, is that there's a kind of fundamental constitutional principle here, and then the third is that the public somehow demand it, somehow expect it. In terms of the Scottish precedent, the fact is that, and this is not a facetious point, there's a precedent for almost everything in British constitutional history. And in fact, Scotland offers two precedents on this issue. They had a referendum in 1997, a second question, which was where the optional power the optional power to vary the basic rate. Okay? Calman changed the whole premise of that and said, actually, you should be forced to make decisions on income tax. And that's, you know, there was no referendum involved there at all. Okay, so that was a very different argument. It's not an option. You're being forced to do this to be responsible. So I would say the Scottish precedent is much less compelling than people assume. In terms of the fundamental constitutional principle, you know, is making an already existing layer of government more accountable? You know, is that breaching? And you know, and Silk, the Silk Commission itself ties itself into knots because it argues that there's a fundamental constitutional issue around income tax powers, but not around minor taxes. Okay, and I think, you know, well, they struggle. I think the argument they end up with is scholastic in the extreme. And then in terms of do the public accept it, we've got two bits of data on that. Something in the Silk Commission, which incidentally, which frames a very, very broadly framed question about devolving income tax powers completely, which is not there. And then there's also, of course, a majority there for actually a referendum on minor tax powers, which nobody's talking about. And then we got some evidence from just before Silk, trying to ask people, okay, we assume actually that a lot of people would say yes to a referendum on anything. Okay? So I think the key question is, and we don't want to have a referendum on everything, do we? Okay? So is this an issue which is particularly important, people feel particularly strongly about? And the evidence that we have is no. Income tax, shared income tax powers is not something that people have very strong feeling. In fact, there was not a majority for a referendum on that in the data that we collected.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just follow up on one or 2 points there. I mean, I think in the UK in general, we frankly have got ourselves in a little bit of a mess in terms of what are the sorts of issues on which we should have referendums and the sorts of things which should be properly left to representative democracy. You know, we elect people to broadly speaking, make the decisions. I mean, the House of Lords Constitutional Affairs Committee a few years ago, I think, published a very good report on this. The broad thrust of which, I think, was arguing that essentially there has been no principle in terms of when we hold referendums and not. It's been much more about political opportunism. The Lords Committee, I think, was broadly suggesting we should reserve referendums for major matters of constitutional principle, like abolishing the monarchy, abolishing House of Parliament, or maybe, you know, setting up a devolved institution. Like Richard, I'm not at all convinced that devolving income tax powers in the manner suggested by Silk is compelling, given, you know, as Richard said, there are precedents for almost everything. We have, in recent decades, for instance, established 2 wholly new systems of local government taxation in community charge, poll tax and council tax, without, I think, even the suggestion of a referendum on either. You know, transferring partial responsibility over an existing tax from one level of government to other, is that more fundamental, really? I don't think so myself. Richard said some of the evidence we've gathered. I mean, we even asked people down to what we thought were blatantly ridiculous items to have a referendum on, like the 5p charge on carrier bags. And you still get over 30% of people saying, yes, we should have referendums on that. I mean, if people are asked, do you want to say, they tend to say yes. It doesn't follow from that, however, they will actually want to take part and be interested and go out and vote in the referendum when it actually happens.
It's an interesting discussion we can have. You know, I think the demand for a referendum does reflect the loss of confidence in the political class as a whole. And I think that's why people do generally say, yes, they want a referendum, because there's a feeling that they do want to take part and have an influence. But back to the original question. In view of the fact that we are debating now, scrutinising the draft Wales Bill as it stands, is it your given position then that you're opposed to a referendum full stop, or would you prefer to see that referendum become a meaningful referendum because of the issue of the lockstep?
Well, I mean, my own view, and Richard may have a slightly different view, I'm certainly not persuaded by the principal case for a referendum, and I thought, you know, the Silk Commission 1 report was an intellectually very impressive document until a couple of pages when they discussed the referendum, when I thought the standard dives down dramatically.
That's where the politics came in.
and then dives back up. But, you know, I'm not myself a die-hard opponent of referendums, but I think, you know, there are probably more compelling things to have referendums on than this. I think my biggest concerns, frankly, are practically. As we've talked about already, this, people who know far more about us in the previous session were saying, these look fairly unusable powers. And in practice, who is actually going to go out and campaign for this referendum on either side? Perhaps particularly the yes side, and I suspect, I fear that I suspect we may have at least one individual here, but I suspect that, frankly, this referendum would make the March 2011 referendum look like a triumph of participatory democracy. I would not be at all surprised if you got turnout levels below 25%.
Just a final question then. Is it your view that the powers envisaged to be transferred as a result of a referendum as it currently stands, do you think that those powers are so inconsequential that there will not be a referendum called?
There is, there's a kind of, in order to unlock these powers, why would you bother? Why would you bother? You can't meaningfully vary the rates. So why would you bother? The only reason to bother is to make the borrowing envelope bigger. And it's surely perverse to have a referendum which is practically about the size of a borrowing envelope. That would just be, that's just perverse in my view.
Just quickly move on, but I think there's a supplementary from Glyn and Neil.
Well, to some extent, especially Richard, you're giving sort of opinion in terms of the referendum, which is right. To challenge that opinion with another opinion, I've always thought that the view of the people is important, but I don't think a referendum is the right way to get it. Personally, one would be content if the parties which formed the next government had made it clear in their manifesto that this is what they were in favour of. I personally interpret that as being the will of the people. If that hadn't been clear in the parties' manifestos, I think the case for a referendum is much, much stronger. But that's almost not a constitutional thing. Manifestos aren't constitutional documents, so there's an area of a lack of clarity. But I do think to move forward to this without the view of the people in one form is quite a dangerous thing to do.
I would have no, that would seem to me, Glyn, to be a sensible way of doing this if one wanted to do it. What I was trying to get at very briefly, Chair, is that the justifications that have been offered for a referendum seem to me to be very weak.
I think we better move on to dual candidacy and try and come back afterwards if there's time.
Firstly, to Professor Scully, you very consistently argued the case against the ban on dual candidacy. Prior to, I recall, I think you both came before the Select Committee at the time of the Government of Wales Bill in 2006. You reiterated your opposition to the ban. Can you remind the committee why you've taken such a strong stance against the ban?
I think as I articulated in the written evidence that I submitted, I think the arguments against dual candidacy are flawed both in principle and have problematic practical implications. I think, and I know some people feel very strongly against dual candidacy, and I don't challenge the sincerity of their views, but I do believe that they are based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the electoral system that was introduced for assembly elections. In particular, the argument is made that defeated candidates at the constituency level have been rejected by the electorate, therefore they should not be able to enter the assembly. But the proportional variant of AMS that we use for assembly elections, that is used in quite a few other countries around the world now, is a voting system whereby parties through the list seats are compensated if they have been relatively unsuccessful in the constituencies. Parties that have been, in a sense, you want to put it like that, rejected at the constituency level, still get some representation in the chamber, and it's difficult to see a strong principled reason why what applies to parties should not also apply to individual candidates. The other reasons why I'm opposed to a ban on dual candidacy is, first of all, it creates potentially perverse incentives, which I don't think legislation ought to do. For instance, if you have separate constituency and list groups of candidates, the list ones then effectively acquire an incentive for their party's constituency candidates to lose. I think that is not, and indeed one or two people here know about that directly, and I think that that is not a sensible sort of incentive to build into a system, also for the voters. The voters, if you particularly favour a list candidate, now you maybe have to vote against that party, or you would want to vote against that party at the constituency level. But I think there's a third reason, which is specific to Wales. Having a very small assembly of 60 members, and various people, including my colleague here, have argued that's really insufficient. But, having such a small body, we need to do everything possible, I think, to maximise the quality of the representation within that body. Having, in particular, so few people to do all the committee work and all the various roles other than leadership and ministerial. We have a relatively small number of people spread pretty thinly, and we need to do everything possible to make sure that those people are of the maximum quality. And I think the New Zealand inquiry into this system articulated the case very well, that dual candidacy can help parties not ensure but make more likely the election of people who those parties believe are their strongest candidates.
The size of the
Wales, that's something we should be doing.
We'll come on to the size of the Assembly in a minute. Just you touched on international work. Can you remind us of other examples where such a ban does exist? I seem to remember one country that was we used remorselessly, unsuccessfully, as it happened at the time of the Government Wales Bill. But did you remind us of those international precedents?
There are two variants of these mixed member systems. Mixed member proportional, where the list seats are allocated in a way that compensates for the constituency results, and a mixed member majoritarian, where there are effectively two separate elections. Amongst mixed member proportional, Wales leads the world. We are the only sub-state nation, region or country that has introduced a ban like this. It was considered, I'm aware, seriously in two Canadian provinces, but not ultimately introduced. It was considered in two Canadian provinces, Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, I believe. And it was also looked at very seriously in the very detailed review of this system in New Zealand, but decisively rejected. The only examples that I'm aware of where a ban has been introduced has been in the systems where you have essentially constituency and list as running as two separate elections. I'm aware certainly of 4 national systems that have introduced a ban: South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Ukraine. The last 2 of which are not particularly examples of good democratic practice.
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, yeah. Just moving on. You talked about the size of the Assembly. The draft bill does nothing to change the size of the number of Assembly members. I think Mr. Scully has indicated, like many of us would agree, it should. Size of the Assembly, Professor James.
Yes, I mean, Richard's been involved in work on this.
Yes, we published a report with the rather lowbrow title Size Matters, which looked at the size of the Assembly, and I think has been the only serious attempt to look at the size of the National Assembly for Wales. There was no process. If you look back at the Labour Party's internal processes in the 90s, which led to the 60-member proposal, there was no, and of course the Assembly had very different powers in the early days anyway, but there was no kind of systematic look at the size of the Assembly and the implications of that. And we tried to do that and tried to marshal as much international evidence as we can, and obviously I would refer colleagues to the reports for the detail. But the headline is there are 42 Assembly members to do all the work that is required in terms of scrutiny, and that is a very, very small number in international terms. It's a low number when one considers in comparative terms the relative power of the National Assembly, and our best estimate of the right kind of size, and I accept that people would have different views and it's not an exact science, but around 100 members would make sense in terms of the relative powers of the Assembly. But also, I would just make one point, is that there is a context here of where do Welsh elected representatives sit. Now, clearly, I think it's still on the statute book as a proposal that the number of Welsh MPs gets reduced. Maybe I shouldn't mention that in present company. But we also have we now have some leaks, I think, coming out of the Williams report suggesting a major cut of councillors in Wales, where we have, in comparative terms, arguably too many MPs, certainly too many councillors. There aren't probably many councillors. We can probably all agree on that, and we do look light in terms of holding what is now a powerful Welsh government to account in the Assembly.
So the fact that the draft bill does leave in place the current linkage between the size of the National Assembly and the number of Welsh MPs is unhelpful.
Well, in my view, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And not least, as you say, if we were to go down the line in Westminster at some future point in terms of reduction of MPs, then the fears that have been raised, certainly in the past, will be realised again. Have you got anything to add to that, or do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, on this issue, at least, I'd broadly agree with my colleague.
Good. Just finally, Professor Scully, you argue in your written evidence that it would be more appropriate for the National Assembly to be responsible for the decisions on its own elections. As a good devolutionist, I agree, but why?
Yeah. I mean, in the long term, I'm not convinced it's really appropriate for Parliament here to be deciding major matters on the electoral arrangements for another body with its own democratic mandate. I've also suggested, though, as part of that, one might look to build in some sort of structures to ensure that any future changes to electoral arrangements command broad cross-party support. As I mentioned in my written evidence, parties are inherently interested parties, interested actors when it comes to electoral arrangements. That is unavoidably so. That being the case, I think it should be the case that it is made difficult for politicians to change electoral arrangements. It shouldn't be easy to change the electoral system in a way which may just happen to be more favourable to your own party. So, I mean, I think if at some point the power over setting the rules for Assembly elections is transferred to the Assembly, that should be done, perhaps, but should only be done with a sort of supermajority requirement imposed. And my suggestion is that it should be pretty high. Actually, a 3/4 majority should be needed for any substantive changes in electoral arrangements. It shouldn't be possible for, I think, for one party or coalition with a very narrow majority simply to change the rules to make things a bit more helpful to themselves. And that goes for whoever's in power at whatever time.
I think that's a good point. May I just bring in Jessica Morgan very quickly?
Or candidacy.
Yes.
Clearly the famous example of this is Clwyd West, where 2003 Alan Pugh gets in and all the other three candidates end up on the list. Clearly that's ludicrous. How would you defend that particular result? Where every all three losers end up on the list.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't myself obviously attach that particular description to those individuals, but
fair point.
that is
losing candidates.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? That if I could just ask, it's the same question, but essentially the impact assessment, a majority of the respondents would agree with what Jessica Morton's just said. They find it very difficult to conceive. They've actually said they would like to keep the ban in place. So, how does that play, really? Public perception.
Okay. First of all, on Ms Morden's question, Clwyd West was clearly an extreme example of the general phenomenon which dual candidacy allows for. It is, I suppose, a relatively exceptional instance of what the system is set up to allow, that if parties happen to put particular individuals high on the list, parties being compensated for their relative lack of success in constituencies, you can see those individuals being elected through the list. I mean, it's very unusual that they all happen to come from the one seat.
Because it was a marginal seat, wasn't it?
But I mean, that is basically what the system exists to do. That is how the system operates internationally, and was understood at the time of the '98 legislation.
Would the concerns being expressed about Clwyd West, would that have been mitigated if we had an open list system rather than a closed list system? Because the problem with the closed list system is that it's very much in the hands of the parties, whereas people would have a feeling that they had voted for somebody on an open list. So would the open list system mitigate the concern that losers, for example, are still returned?
Well, an open list system where the list votes were cast perhaps for a particular individual on a party list, I think that would need to be looked at. That possibly complicates the system a little bit further. In terms, but yes, I mean, if people really want to reject particular individuals, then an open list system clearly facilitates that. To move on to Ms. Griffith's question on sort of what the people think about this and so on. I mean, I don't think we've yet really had any robust evidence on this. I mean, people writing with their views and so on. At the time of the 2006 Act, I think arguments were made by the then government which certainly went well beyond the evidence on public attitudes that existed to support them. I think in terms of relevant evidence from the vast amount of survey work that we've done, we don't find that many people seem to be greatly bothered about this. I think the only two ways you could try and get at public opinion systematically would be, firstly, a fairly large amount of focus group work conducted by genuinely neutral parties, putting the cases both for and against, and sort of walking people through the arguments on both sides. And if you did that with a sufficiently large number of people, you might come to a clear view. The other sort of evidence one could say on public attitudes is, if the public really objected, then that would presumably hurt the parties that most use dual candidacy. Well, in Scotland, it's been used heavily by the SNP. It's not self-evident that that's harmed them a great deal. In Wales in 2003, dual candidacy was actually used by far the most by the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, who the two parties have actually increased their share of vote and their representation. So again, it's not obvious that there's a major negative public reaction there in terms of if we look at the behaviour of the voters.
I think we're going to have to just gently move on again, looking at the time. And it's a related issue, so perhaps I could ask Professor Wynne-Jones about this. But we've dealt with dual candidacy. We also want to ask about double jobbing. Obviously, I have to declare an interest, having been an AM and an MP for 2 years. And my view is that there's no reason why that shouldn't happen. You don't get two salaries for it, and I feel strongly that people should be able to go backwards and forwards. And I think it was to the benefit of the Assembly that a number of, may I say, mainly Labour and Plaid Cymru MPs became members of the Welsh Assembly to give it some experience, if you like, when we started off. But anyway, this isn't my evidence session. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I have a professional opinion on this. I have a personal prejudice, which I'm happy to share with you. which would be that, if I was a voter, I would actually, want somebody concentrating full time on a particular job. But my kind of general position is up to the electorate to decide. If the candidate is being upfront, then the electorate is perfectly within their right to make the call either way. I personally have a view, but
I think just one very minor point to this. I mean, I think it does get, to some degree, get back to the whole issue of the size of the Assembly. And again, if we're only going to carry on having 60 AMs, the whole point that we really need them to be working across a pretty broad range. We need very high quality people. We almost certainly also need them there full time, working flat out. I dare say people who are double jobbing for a while would do it with the best of intentions, but presumably their work as an MP would also be fairly arduous.
But what about the the fact that there's no ban on people being councillors or MEPs at the same time, or indeed in having outside work. I mean, just as many members of Parliament manage to combine the role of MP and minister, and a minister presumably has a pretty big role, as does an MP. Yes. And I mean, I absolutely don't see that it's impossible, and I felt personally that I was able to do the role perfectly well in both places.
Yeah, I mean, my views I was articulating, I think, as my personal preference. I wouldn't necessarily want to go, there's lots of things I feel, but I wouldn't want to have laws passed to enforce them, and I think this would be one of them. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying this should be absolutely prohibited in all circumstances.
Neil Griffith.
I just raise the issue of the actual legislation here, which has a 6-month limit. I mean, do you see that as the most sensible and most workable limit? I'm just taking the example now, supposing somebody in 2015 who's currently an AM becomes an MP, which is quite likely because there are some candidates. If they then have to give up after 6 months, they'd be causing a by-election, whereas if they were a different limit, it could be in the 2016 Assembly election. So, I mean, what would you think would be workable in this legislation?
Well, I mean, I think if you're going to do this, possibly a slightly longer term, to allow for precisely the sort of situation that you referred to would be sensible. To some extent, it might depend on how long, in the long term, how long is going to be the gap between general elections and Assembly elections. If it's continuing to be 12 months, then maybe a short extension of this period towards 12 months, or at least up to the point at which the Assembly is devolved and you have the campaign, or that would presumably be sensible.
No, I think, as I understand it, the timetables are now locked in, so it would make sense. That's a very good example of a problem you could avoid by having that as a year, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Jessica Morden.
In the draft bill, there's the mention of changing the term of the length of the Assembly from 4 to 5 years. Do you think that's desirable?
I think it's probably inevitable. I don't think it was particularly desirable, and I think we are only now starting to work out some of the implications of extending the Assembly term. For example, the affordability of the Welsh Government's commitment around higher education for that extra year. I think that's going to be very difficult indeed. But once they moved this place to a 5-year fixed-term cycle, I think it was inevitable that would happen in Wales. I mean, it's very important to avoid having devolved and Westminster elections at the same time.
What is wrong with having elections on the same day, which would save a lot of money thereby reducing the cost of politics? It's about increasing turnout.
It's about accountability. It's about making sure that you're trying to focus on the level of government which is responsible for whatever particular issue that you have feelings about. I mean, there's a real problem in the Welsh context, and it doesn't work very well for MPs actually, in terms of how the electorate attributes performance. One of the kind of, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but when things are going well, the electorate think it's all down to the Welsh Government, even in non-devolved issues. And then when in devolved issues, when it's going badly, they blame you guys, and so and actually that is not, I mean, it's quite amusing, but it's not actually good for democracy. So I actually think trying to separate these is actually quite important.
Example that we could look at having simultaneous elections.
I was saying I don't favour simultaneous elections. I think it's important to try and separate out accountability. I mean, it's imperfect, but having it all on the same day, I think, makes it very difficult.
Gwyn Davis.
Sorry, Gwyn.
Because this is just, it seems to me an interesting. I mean, again, I'm not wholly comfortable with the changing to a 5-year term. I think a 4-year term is more suitable. Generally, I think you sound as if you might agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always, because we're having so many elections, we have European elections, we have council elections, we're having referendums coming out of the back of your, and there's bound to be things happening on the same day. So why is it specifically different that an assembly election and a parliamentary election cannot be held on the same day? Or a month apart. I mean, the rules allow for them to be a month apart. No?
Well, I think possibly a month apart would be the worst of all worlds, in that both the voters and the campaigners would be just about getting over the one election. They'd have to launch straight back into the next one. Whichever set of elections came second, I think would get, the campaigners would get a very rough reception from the voters. Not you lot again. And I think the voters need to have some time to recover from the first election. I think in the Welsh context, though, having a relatively weak Welsh news media, it's all the more important that if you're going to have an assembly, that the election should be separate from the Westminster election, because otherwise I think in Wales all issues related to the assembly, its competencies, policy programmes of the different parties would get completely swamped by the agenda of the London-based news media. And I think it would actually raise some problematic questions about the legitimacy of the mandate of whoever was in power in Cardiff Bay. And just to go back to a point Richard was making just there and expand on it slightly.
We've got 6 years.
We've gathered quite a lot of very systematic evidence on this in Wales, and this is a repeated finding year after year in surveys, that a lack of clarity of attribution for policy responsibilities, and people for devolved issues or non-devolved issues being overly likely to attribute good news to people in Cardiff Bay, bad news to people in London. And that's amusing if you go tell an audience of people in Cardiff Bay that, but actually, it shouldn't be like that. That's actually really quite unhealthy. If people in the devolved institutions are messing up, they should be held responsible for that.
I completely agree with that, but just sort of a practical point, do you agree with me that we've talked about also adjusting the numbers of AMs and MPs, that will inevitably result in constituency boundaries which are not identical. Therefore, if you've had concurrent elections on different boundaries, do you agree that that compounds the problem?
Well, that would be just one more complication. That would actually also, I think, make things rather complicated for a lot of the people who do the mundane work of electoral administration, which is an unglamorous job but a very important one, and we don't particularly need to make their job any harder.
We're running out of time a little bit, so I'm just going to quickly ask Geraint Davies to answer.
Can I ask, I think Professor Scully mentioned that when you ask people, do you want to say, it was in relation to referenda, they tend to say yes. Mm-hmm. And would you agree then that if you say, would it be better, other things being equal, to decide things locally rather than over there, they also say yes? And also you mentioned that people at the moment tend to sort of blame Westminster and praise Cardiff. So do you think there's sort of inherent problems that we may end up with a situation where people have referendums where they vote for something which isn't in fact in their interest because there's economies of scale or whatever it is?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think, if you ask people and they haven't been thinking about it a great deal, do you want to say? They can say yes. If you ask them about sort of which level of politicians do you trust most, it tends to be those who are a little bit closer to them physically, geographically. When it actually comes, though, to real referendums asking people about their views, I think slightly different dynamics start to kick into play. First of all, a lot of people who said, yes, I want to say, actually don't get interested at all and don't turn out and vote. Of those who do participate, I think there's pretty robust international evidence with which I think British experience is consistent, that there's a reasonably strong sort of status quo bias to referendums. In other words, if people are unsure, they tend to vote for what they have now. So actually, to get people to vote for substantial change, you do generally have to make a reasonably compelling case. And
I'm just making the point that you sort of made the point that other things being equal, the sort of the proposition of devolution is very attractive because it's always, we'll do more here, even if in the outcomes it's not always as attractive.
Well, I think I think what we're finding in our public survey evidence is more about attributions, particularly of blame. If you think things are going badly, and most people think lots of things are going fairly badly much of the time, who ultimately is going to be responsible for that, or who are you most likely to attribute blame to? And that's people in Wales are disproportionately likely to attribute that to government in London and to Westminster. And they have lower levels of trust in MPs than they do in AMs, even though I don't think there's any very detailed evidence that people know more about their AMs or whatever. But
can I ask, sorry, I think Professor Wynne-Jones mentioned he thought that we should have 100 members in the Assembly, and that would be representing 3 million people in Wales. Of course, there's nearer to 60 million across the United Kingdom. So do you think, from your point of view, it would be a good idea to have sort of 20 assemblies of 100 members, you know, with devolved powers everywhere? I mean, obviously, I appreciate that 20% of people in Wales speak Welsh, but putting that to one side, in terms of the efficacy of government, do you think there's a case for more and more of these units, localised, you know, Welsh Assembly governments?
I mean, I'm happy to discuss my views on how you govern the UK, but I think we would. But the point,
the cost and the overhead.
Yeah, no. The point I'm trying to make, and the report tries to make, is different. We have now in Wales a powerful Welsh government. I mean, it's got a large budget, it's got extensive powers, and the question is it being held effectively to account? And can 42 backbenchers do that? And I think the evidence suggests not. And so it is in the context of an already existing government, is that being held properly to account? And so it's not a general point about, you know, how should you have regional devolution in England or whatever. I happen to think not, but that's beside the point.
Why not? Well, why shouldn't they have it?
Because there's no demand at all in England for regional devolution, at all. But my point is about
demand, not outcomes, then.
Yeah, I mean, I think
it's a political question.
We're probably getting slightly off our...
Yes.
But it's a very good question, and I find myself in some sympathy with my colleague here. I mean, if you don't think they should have regional devolution, don't you think they should have in England an English Parliament, the equivalent of the Welsh Assembly or Scottish Parliament?
Personally, yes.
Yeah. God. Well, that's a great short answer. Can I just turn to Simon Hart then, who's got one final question?
It's a sort of
it's not a UKIP answer.
It's a sort of final question anyway, but I just wondered what you read into the rebrand of Welsh Assembly Government to Welsh Government. What does that mean to you? What does it mean to voters?
My own view is essentially recognising a fact on the ground. This has become sort of, you know, customary usage. It's a term that's been adopted a little bit like, you know, with in the 2006 Act, the recognition of the effective de facto abolition of the body corporate and the establishment of a separate executive and legislature. That had become an established fact on the ground and was recognised in legislation. I think this is fairly similar, really.
Well, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I think we were talking earlier about attribution and who's responsible for what, and clearly there was huge confusion in the early years of devolution and a lot of frustration that people were not actually recognising a difference between the National Assembly for Wales and what the executive in the Assembly was doing, and you know, there wasn't that kind of awareness. And I think we've seen since then a gradual attempt to actually make sure that people are aware there's a government which is being held to account by the National Assembly, and I think that WASG was maybe the Assembly there was probably slightly confusing, and therefore I think the Welsh Government probably makes a little bit clearer that there is an executive and a legislature.
Is there any evidence to suggest?
I'm sorry?
Is there any evidence to suggest that voters have cottoned onto that yet? Because I have to say, you know, if our constituency caseload is anything to go by, there's precious little evidence that that's made any difference.
There's some evidence that over time things have become, there is a little bit more clarity than there was, but there was complete confusion in the early years of devolution.
It's now only partial confusion.
Yes, it's improving from a low base.
It's improving from a low base.
Yes. Well, I think we'll end on that positive note before questions. But,
thank you.
Thank you both once again. It was entertaining and interesting and useful, so we're very grateful.
Thank you very much.